The morning of September 4th, 1944, arrived grey and wet across the Normandy countryside. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood at the window of his mobile headquarters, watching rain streak down the glass. Outside, the machinery of war ground forward, trucks carrying ammunition, ambulances returning from the front, staff officers hurrying between tents with maps and reports clutched against the weather. Montgomery was 56 years old that September, old enough to have fought in the previous war, young enough to command in this one. His face was lean, sharp-featured, the kind of face that looked like it had been carved rather than born. He wore his trademark beret and battle dress, immaculate despite the mud and chaos that surrounded every military headquarters in France that autumn. Behind him, the operations room hummed with controlled activity. Radios crackled, typewriters clattered. Young lieutenants moved colored pins across enormous wall maps, showing the Allied advance from the Normandy beaches eastward toward the German border. The breakout had succeeded. Paris was liberated. The German army was in retreat. By all measures, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was winning, but winning came with a price, and that morning Montgomery was reviewing the bill. On his desk lay casualty reports from Operation Totalize, concluded just 3 weeks earlier. The offensive had punched through German defenses south of Caen exactly as planned. Canadian divisions had led the assault, attacking at night with armor rolling forward through darkness and smoke. The breakthrough succeeded. German lines collapsed. British divisions poured through the gap and advanced 20 miles in 2 days. A tactical victory by any standard. But the Canadian casualty figures made Montgomery pause. The numbers were heavy, heavier than he had anticipated. Infantry battalions reduced to half strength. Armor losses approaching 40% in the opening hours. These were not the numbers of a careful, methodical operation. These were the numbers of assault troops hurling themselves at fortified positions with a ferocity that bordered on reckless. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come." Brigadier Edgar Williams entered, carrying a manila folder under one arm. Williams was Montgomery's chief intelligence officer, a quiet, methodical man who dealt in facts rather than theories. He had fought alongside Montgomery since North Africa, and Montgomery trusted his judgment completely. "Sir, you asked for the compiled prisoner interrogation reports." "I did." Williams set the folder on the desk. It was thick, perhaps 200 pages. Montgomery looked at it without moving. "Summary, Bill." Williams cleared his throat. He had the uncomfortable look of a man about to deliver news his commander would not like. "Sir, we've conducted extensive interrogations of German prisoners taken during the August operations. Multiple divisions, various units, different sectors of the front. The intelligence section compiled responses looking for patterns in German defensive doctrine, unit morale, supply situations. And? We found a pattern, sir, just not the one we were looking for." Montgomery turned from the window, giving Williams his full attention. "Go on." "German soldiers, when questioned about Allied forces, consistently express greater fear of Canadian troops than British forces. This appears across multiple units with no apparent coordination. It's not propaganda or doctrine. It seems to be genuine sentiment based on combat experience." The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain continued. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, a low, continuous thunder that never quite stopped in that part of France in September 1944. Montgomery walked to his desk and opened the folder. Page 1 was a summary sheet with key findings highlighted in red pencil. He read it twice, slowly. "Give me a specific example." Williams pulled a file from the stack. "Prisoner 1847, captured near Falaise on August 18th. German Army Sergeant, 6 years service, veteran of the Eastern Front. His unit was initially positioned to defend against British forces advancing from the north. On the night of August 16th, they received orders that Canadian divisions were moving into their sector. And Half his company deserted that night, sir. Walked away from their positions. The sergeant stated that his men would rather risk being shot for desertion by their own military police than face Canadian troops in combat. Montgomery set the file down carefully. You believe him? Sir, we have similar statements from 19 other prisoners, different units, different dates, same basic story. German soldiers requesting transfer when they learn Canadians are in their sector. Units suffering higher desertion rates when facing Canadian forces. Several prisoners explicitly requesting to be turned over to British custody rather than Canadian. These men understand they're prisoners of war, yes? That we're all on the same side? They do, sir. They still prefer British custody. Montgomery walked back to the window. He stood there for a long moment, hands clasped behind his back, watching the rain. Everything about this troubled him. Not the facts themselves, but what they implied. He had been commanding British forces since 1939. 5 years of war. From the disaster of France in 1940, through the long defensive years, to the victory at El Alamein that turned the tide in North Africa, he had built his reputation on professionalism, discipline, careful planning. The British Army fought with restraint and method. They followed the rules of war even when the enemy did not. They represented civilization against barbarism. And now his own intelligence reports suggested that German soldiers feared his Canadian allies more than they feared his British forces. The Canadians had only arrived in strength in 1943, less than 2 years of major combat operations. Yet somehow, in that brief time, they had earned a reputation that overshadowed everything Montgomery had built in 5 years of war. It was not anger he felt. Montgomery was too professional for that. It was something more complicated. Curiosity mixed with concern, pride wounded but not broken, and beneath it all, a commander's instinct that this information mattered in ways he did not yet fully understand. I want a meeting, Bill, senior staff, division commanders, and get General Simons. Me? Canadian First Army Commander, sir? Yes. If we're going to discuss why Germans fear his troops, he should be present. When, sir? This afternoon, 1600 hours. Williams saluted and left. Montgomery remained at the window. Below, a column of Canadian infantry marched past headquarters, heading up to the line. They moved with the loose, confident stride of veteran troops who had survived months of combat. Their uniforms were muddy and worn. Their weapons were slung casually across shoulders. They looked nothing like the parade ground soldiers Montgomery remembered from Britain in the early war years. They looked like men who had learned to kill and had gotten very good at it. The meeting convened at precisely 4 o'clock that afternoon in the briefing room of Montgomery's headquarters. Rain still fell outside, turning the Norman countryside into a grey-green blur beyond the windows. Around the table sat the senior commanders of 21st Army Group. 3 British division commanders, veterans all, men in their 40s and 50s who had fought across North Africa and Italy before landing in Normandy. Brigadier Williams with his intelligence files, several staff officers taking notes. And at the far end of the table, Lieutenant General Guy Granville Simons, commander of the 1st Canadian Army. Simons was 41 years old, young for his rank, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his abilities and saw no reason to apologize for them. He had joined the Canadian Army as an artillery officer before the war and risen rapidly through talent and aggression. Unlike many Canadian officers who had trained in the more relaxed colonial military tradition, Simons was professionally trained, tactically innovative, and absolutely convinced of his methods. He also had the look of a man who knew why he had been summoned and was quietly amused by it. Montgomery opened the folder Williams had provided and removed several pages. He did not look at Simons, not yet. Gentlemen, I've asked you here to discuss an intelligence matter that has implications for how we employ our forces going forward. Brigadier Williams will brief you. Williams stood and walked to the map board. He had prepared a summary sheet, carefully neutral in its language. Over the past 3 weeks, interrogation teams have processed approximately 300 German prisoners captured during our August operations. Standard questions regarding unit identification, defensive positions, supply status, morale. During these interrogations, a consistent pattern emerged. He paused, then continued in the same flat, professional tone. German soldiers expressed significantly greater fear of encountering Canadian forces than British forces. This sentiment appears across multiple divisions and unit types. It does not appear to be coordinated propaganda or based on official German doctrine. Intelligence assessment is that this represents genuine soldier-level perception based on combat experience. One of the British commanders, a major general with a carefully groomed moustache, cleared his throat. Surely this is exaggeration. German propaganda attempting to sow discord among Allied forces. Williams shook his head. The statements come from prisoners, sir, not from German broadcasts. They have no apparent reason to lie to us about this. Many seem genuinely relieved to be in British custody rather than Canadian. Another British officer spoke up. Perhaps the Canadians had been assigned more difficult sectors. If Germans faced them under worse conditions, that would explain the perception. Both British and Canadian forces have engaged the same German units in similar terrain, sir. The differential in fear response persists regardless of tactical situation. The room fell quiet. These were professional soldiers, men who understood what was being said even if no one wanted to say it directly. Montgomery had remained silent through this exchange, watching his commanders react. Now he spoke, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. The question before us is simple. Why do German soldiers fear Canadian troops more than British troops? No one answered immediately. Then Simons, who had sat quietly through the entire briefing, leaned forward slightly. With respect, sir, perhaps the better question is why shouldn't they? Every head turned toward him. Simons met their stares without flinching. My men are volunteers, gentlemen. Every one of them crossed the Atlantic Ocean by choice to fight in a war that does not directly threaten Canadian soil. British soldiers defend their homeland. Admirable, necessary, and I don't question their courage for a moment. But my boys chose to be here. They chose this fight. That creates a different mindset. One of the British generals bristled. Are you suggesting Canadian forces are more motivated than British troops? I'm suggesting they're differently motivated, sir. A man defending his home fights to protect what he loves. A man who chose to travel 3,000 miles to fight does so for different reasons, perhaps more aggressive reasons, or less civilized ones, the general muttered. Simon's expression did not change, but something cold entered his eyes. My men have fought from Sicily through Italy and now France. They've taken every objective assigned to them. If the Germans fear them, perhaps that says something about Canadian effectiveness rather than British inadequacy. The tension in the room was immediate and sharp. Montgomery had anticipated this. Coalition warfare always involved egos and national pride. Managing those tensions was part of his job. Gentlemen, his voice was not loud, but it carried absolute authority. The room quieted instantly. General Simons raises a valid point about motivation, but I think we're missing something larger. Montgomery stood and walked to the map board. He pointed to the invasion beaches, then traced the Allied advance inland with one finger. I have studied German military operations extensively. Their early war successes in Poland, France, the Low Countries, blitzkrieg doctrine, fast, aggressive, accepting casualties to maintain operational momentum, never stopping to consolidate, never allowing the enemy time to recover, punch through, keep moving, let logistics sort itself out later. He turned to face the assembled officers. Canadians fight the way Germans fought in 1940. Fast, aggressive, willing to take losses to maintain momentum, not slowed down by the careful, methodical planning that characterizes British operations. Simons watched him carefully. The British commanders shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, surely you're not comparing Allied forces to German aggression," one of them said. "I'm comparing tactical approaches, General, and before anyone takes offense, let me be clear. I am not offering simple praise." Montgomery walked back to the table and placed both hands flat on its surface, leaning forward slightly. That style of warfare worked brilliantly for Germany in 1940 and 1941. It also led to catastrophic casualties when the operational situation changed. When they invaded the Soviet Union with the same tactics, they drove deep into Russian territory. Then winter came, supply lines stretched, the Soviets counterattacked. German forces that had been pursuing aggressive operational tempo suddenly found themselves overextended and dying in the snow. He straightened. "The question before us is not whether Canadian aggressiveness is effective. Clearly it is. The question is whether it is sustainable and whether we should employ it differently than we employ British forces." The room was very quiet now. These were serious men considering a serious question. Simon spoke again, more carefully now. "Sir, are you asking whether my methods are sound?" "I'm asking what they cost, General, and whether that cost is acceptable given our strategic objectives. My divisions have accomplished every mission assigned." "At what price?" The question hung in the air. Simons did not answer immediately. Montgomery continued. "I need to understand what we have here so I can use it properly. Your troops clearly fight with exceptional aggression. German soldiers recognize this and fear it. That makes Canadian forces a valuable asset for specific types of operations." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But aggressive tactics that work in a short, decisive campaign can destroy an army in a long war of attrition. I need to know which war we're fighting before I decide how to employ your divisions going forward." Simons considered this. "Sir, I believe we're fighting a war we're going to win in the next year. Germany is collapsing. We have material superiority. The strategic situation favors aggressive operations that exploit German weakness before they can reorganize. And if you're wrong, if this war continues into 1946, 1947, then we'll adjust our methods accordingly, sir. But right now, today, my approach is winning battles." Montgomery nodded slowly. He could not argue with that. Totalize had worked. Canadian aggression had broken through German lines exactly as planned. The strategic situation did favor offensive operations. But something still troubled him. Something deeper than tactical questions or immediate results. He had commanded in the previous war. He remembered the Somme, Passchendaele, British generals hurling men at German fortifications year after year, accepting horrific casualties because aggressive offense was the only strategy they knew. It had worked eventually. Germany collapsed in 1918. But at what cost? Hundreds of thousands of British soldiers dead, an entire generation bled white. Victory achieved through attrition so terrible it had shaped British strategic thinking ever since. Never again would Britain accept such losses. Never again would commanders waste lives on futile attacks. Yet here, in 1944, Montgomery had under his command a force that fought exactly that way, not because they were poorly led or ignorant of costs, but because they believed aggressive offense was the path to victory. And the terrible thing was, in the current context, they might be right. "Very well," Montgomery said finally. "I want a complete review of Canadian operations from Dieppe forward. Every major engagement, tactics employed, casualties sustained, objectives achieved. I want to understand exactly how your forces fight and what it costs." "Sir, may I ask why?" "Because, General, the Germans fear your troops more than mine. That fear is a weapon. I intend to learn how to use it effectively, but I also intend to understand its price before I commit to a strategy built around it." Simons nodded. "You'll have whatever reports you need, sir." Good. Dismissed, gentlemen. The officers filed out, leaving Montgomery alone with Williams. Bill, I want something else. Sir? Background on Dieppe, August 1942. I wasn't in command then, but that operation shaped Canadian thinking about how to fight. I need to understand what they learned and why they learned it. I'll pull the files, sir. Williams left. Montgomery remained seated, staring at the map on the wall. Dieppe. The name itself was notorious, a disaster. 3,000 Canadians landed on a heavily defended French port in a badly planned amphibious assault. 2,000 casualties in less than 6 hours, bodies floating in the surf, tanks burning on the beach. Churchill had called it a necessary lesson. The Canadians who survived called it a slaughter, but they had learned something from that slaughter, something that made them fight the way they did now, something that made German soldiers desert rather than face them. Montgomery needed to understand what that lesson was, because he was beginning to suspect that Canadian aggression was not just tactical preference or cultural difference, it was calculated response to trauma. Men who had died by the hundreds on Dieppe Beach because they hesitated, because they waited for orders, because they tried to fight carefully. The survivors had learned a simple, terrible lesson. Hesitation kills. Caution costs lives. The only way to survive is to attack harder, faster, more viciously than the enemy expects. It was not an unreasonable conclusion given their experience, but it was also not sustainable in every kind of war. Outside, darkness was falling across Normandy. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and smelling of mud. Lights came on in headquarters tents. Somewhere in the distance, artillery fired, the sound rolling across the countryside like far-off thunder. Montgomery stood and walked to the window one final time. Tomorrow he would begin reviewing the Canadian combat record in detail. He would study their methods, analyze their costs, understand their tactical doctrine. He would figure out how to employ this aggressive, fearsome force effectively without destroying it in the process. But tonight, standing in the gathering darkness, he allowed himself to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that had been growing in his mind since Williams first handed him that intelligence report. The Germans were right to fear Canadian troops. They fought with a ferocity that exceeded normal Western Allied standards. They showed less restraint, pushed harder even when taking terrible casualties. And Montgomery, professional soldier that he was, recognized that ferocity for what it was, incredibly effective in the right circumstances and potentially catastrophic in the wrong ones. His job, his burden as commander, was to ensure they only fought in the right circumstances, to use their aggression as a weapon while preventing it from becoming a liability. To win this war before the cost of Canadian methods exceeded their value. It was what generals did. They made calculations about lives and deaths. They spent men to achieve objectives. They balanced effectiveness against sustainability and made decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Montgomery had made such decisions before. He would make them again. But first, he needed to understand exactly what weapon he possessed in these fierce Canadian divisions, and what it would ultimately cost to use it. The files arrived on Montgomery's desk over the next 3 days. Thick manila folders stamped with security classifications, after-action reports from Sicily and Italy, intelligence assessments from German documents captured in Normandy, casualty statistics compiled by meticulous staff officers who reduced human suffering to neat columns of numbers. Montgomery cleared his schedule and read them all. He started with Dieppe because everything seemed to start with Dieppe. The operational plan had been ambitious, perhaps fatally so. A brigade-strength raid on a fortified French port designed to test German coastal defenses and gather intelligence for future amphibious operations. Canadian forces would land at dawn, hold the town for several hours, then withdraw before German reinforcements arrived. Montgomery studied the maps showing the landing beaches, narrow shingle, covered by German machine gun positions on the cliffs above, concrete fortifications built into the town's architecture, fields of fire carefully prepared to turn the waterfront into a killing ground. Then he read the casualty reports. Of the 3,000 Canadians who landed, fewer than half returned to England. 900 dead, nearly 2,000 captured, many of them wounded. Tank crews burned alive when their Churchill tanks couldn't climb the shingle beach and were destroyed one by one. Infantry pinned down in the open with nowhere to hide. Men dying in the surf, in the streets, against the sea wall, in the first terrible minutes when they realized the operation had failed. The after-action analysis was brutal in its honesty. Intelligence failures, inadequate fire support, poor coordination between air, naval and ground forces, defenders far stronger than expected. The operation should never have been launched with the forces available. But what caught Montgomery's attention was a separate report filed weeks after the raid, a psychological assessment of Canadian units that had participated. The report noted changes in how survivors approached combat. Less trust in careful planning, greater emphasis on aggressive action over methodical preparation, a pervasive belief that hesitation in combat was more dangerous than reckless advance. The psychologist who wrote the report described it as trauma response. Montgomery, reading it in September 1944 with 2 years of hindsight, saw it differently. The Canadians had learned a lesson at Dieppe. Perhaps the wrong lesson, or perhaps the right lesson for the wrong war. At Dieppe, they had died because the operation was poorly conceived and inadequately supported. But what the survivors internalized was simpler and more visceral. They had died because they waited, because they followed the plan, because they tried to fight the careful British way. The men who survived were the ones who attacked immediately, who pushed forward despite casualties, who moved fast enough to get off the beach before German fire could concentrate on them. So when Canadian forces returned to Europe in 1943, they came with a new doctrine written in blood on a French beach: hit hard, move fast, never stop attacking. Montgomery closed the Dieppe file and reached for Sicily. July 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, designed to knock Italy out of the war and open a new front against Germany. British forces under Montgomery himself landing on the eastern coast, Americans under Patton in the west, and in the center, Canadian divisions making their combat return to Europe. The initial landings went well enough, but as Allied forces pushed inland, they encountered strong German defensive positions anchored around ancient Sicilian hill towns. Stone buildings hundreds of years old, turned into fortresses by professional German troops who understood defensive warfare better than anyone in the world. British forces approached these positions methodically, artillery preparation lasting hours, sometimes days, infantry advances supported by armor, moving carefully from one position to the next. When resistance proved too strong, they would halt, call for more artillery, wait for air support. It was professional, disciplined warfare. It minimized casualties. It also gave German defenders time to prepare, time to bring up reinforcements, time to organize counterattacks. The Canadians fought differently. Montgomery found an after-action report from a British liaison officer attached to a Canadian division during the advance on Leonforte, a fortified town in central Sicily. The officer's account was detailed and quietly disturbed. The Canadian approach to Leonforte had been direct to the point of brutality. Minimal artillery preparation, barely enough to suppress German defensive fire. Then infantry and tanks advancing straight up the slope toward the town in broad daylight. German positions opened fire. Canadians took casualties, but they kept moving. The British liaison officer noted that a British division facing similar defences in a nearby sector had called for heavy artillery support and prepared for a deliberate assault over 2 or 3 days. The Canadians attacked immediately with the forces at hand. They lost 30% of their assault troops in the first hour, but they took the town in 1 day. The German defenders, expecting a more methodical British approach, were overrun before they could organize an effective defense. By the time German reinforcements arrived, Canadians held the high ground and the battle was over. Montgomery read this report twice, then pulled the operational summaries comparing British and Canadian advances in Sicily. The pattern was clear. Canadian divisions suffered higher casualties per engagement, but they also achieved their objectives faster and advanced farther in less time. It was the kind of calculation that kept commanders awake at night. Higher losses per battle, but potentially lower overall casualties if campaigns ended sooner. The next file was Italy, and Italy was where the pattern became undeniable. Canadian forces had transferred from Sicily to the Italian mainland in September 1943, joining the long, bloody campaign up the peninsula. The fighting in Italy was some of the worst of the war. Mountainous terrain that favoured defenders, rivers running perpendicular to the Allied advance, each one requiring a crossing under fire. German forces fighting skilled defensive battles, trading space for Allied casualties, making every mile cost blood. And in December 1943, there was Ortona. Montgomery had read preliminary reports about Ortona while it was happening. Now, 9 months later, he read the complete after-action analysis and understood why German soldiers feared Canadians. Ortona was a small coastal town in eastern Italy, strategically insignificant but turned into a fortress by elements of the German 1st Parachute Division. Elite troops, veterans of Crete and Russia, professionals who knew urban combat better than almost any force in the German military. They prepared to defend Ortona the way paratroopers defended towns, one building at a time, one room at a time, making the attackers pay for every foot of ground. Canadian infantry attacked in mid-December. The battle lasted 4 weeks. The fighting was intimate and horrifying. Canadians couldn't use artillery without destroying the town and killing civilians still trapped inside. German snipers covered every street. Machine guns commanded every intersection. Buildings were booby-trapped. Rubble was mined. The Canadians developed new tactics out of necessity. They stopped using the streets entirely. Instead, they blew holes in the walls between buildings and moved through the interiors. Mouse-holing, they called it. Explosives to breach the wall, grenades thrown through the hole, then infantry charging in with submachine guns blazing, room to room, building to building, for 4 weeks without pause. Montgomery found a German intelligence report that had been captured later in the campaign. The report analyzed Canadian tactics at Ortona and recommended responses, but what struck Montgomery was not the tactical analysis, it was the tone. The German intelligence officer compared fighting in Ortona to combat on the Eastern Front, not the Western Front, where armies maneuvered and followed conventions of civilized warfare. The Eastern Front, where Germans and Soviets fought with an intensity and brutality that exceeded anything in the West. The report specifically noted that Canadian troops showed a disregard for casualties and persistence of attack, more typical of Soviet assault tactics than Western Allied forces. It recommended that German units facing Canadians should prepare for close-quarters combat and should not expect enemy attacks to break off even under heavy casualties. This was high praise from a professional enemy. And it was also a warning. Montgomery set the report down and rubbed his eyes. It was past midnight now. His headquarters was quiet, just a few staff officers on night duty, working under dim electric light while the rest of the camp slept. He pulled the Normandy files next, the campaign that was still ongoing, the battles that were still fresh. D-Day, June 6th. Canadian forces landing at Juno Beach. The report showed they had pushed farther inland on the first day than any other Allied formation, reaching objectives that planners had not expected to be taken until D+2 or D+3. They had done this by maintaining aggressive forward movement even while taking casualties. Then the fighting around Caen through June and July. Operations Charnwood and Atlantic. Canadian infantry and armour attacking fortified German positions repeatedly despite horrific losses. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, defending with fanatical determination. Montgomery found incident reports from British officers attached to Canadian units during this period. Several described Canadian troops shooting German prisoners who were attempting to surrender. Others reported Canadian units refusing to accept surrenders during active operations. The most troubling reports involved the cycle of reprisal killings between Canadians and the 12th SS Panzer. The SS had executed Canadian prisoners in the days after D-Day. 20 men murdered after surrendering, shot in cold blood. Canadian forces had responded with their own executions. Captured SS troops were shot while attempting to escape. A British captain filed a formal complaint after witnessing Canadian infantry shoot 3 German soldiers who emerged from a position with hands raised. When the captain protested, the Canadian sergeant looked at him and said simply, "They started it." The complaint went nowhere. The captain's commanding officer told him quietly that different armies fought different wars. This troubled Montgomery more than the casualty statistics. War had rules, however often they were violated. Prisoners were supposed to be treated humanely. These were not just legal obligations, but moral ones, part of what separated civilized nations from barbarism. Yet here were Allied forces committing atrocities in response to German atrocities. The logic was understandable. Prisoners required guards. In the middle of an offensive, shooting prisoners was expedient. It was also murder. Montgomery drafted a carefully worded memo to Simons about the need for discipline and proper treatment of prisoners. Simons' response arrived 2 days later, equally carefully worded but clear in its message. "My men fight an enemy who bombs civilians and executes prisoners. I will enforce discipline where possible, but I won't hamstring combat effectiveness for the sake of appearances." Montgomery understood this was as far as Simons would bend. The Canadian commander would not rein in his troops' aggression because that aggression was fundamental to how they fought. And Montgomery, pragmatic commander that he was, accepted it because he needed that aggression, because it won battles. Because in September 1944, with Germany on the defensive and Allied victory increasingly certain, tactical effectiveness mattered more than perfect moral consistency. He made a note in his private journal that night. "The Canadians fight as we wish all our forces would fight, with determination and without hesitation. But there are costs to this approach that extend beyond casualties. I use them because they are effective. God help me if I use them wrongly." The final evidence came from German sources. Captured German documents throughout the campaign included numerous references to Canadian forces. Montgomery requested that intelligence officers compile everything mentioning Canadians specifically. A German division commander in Normandy had issued an order in July warning his troops they would soon face Canadian forces. The order described Canadian tactical preferences in detail: minimal artillery preparation, aggressive infantry tank cooperation, tendency to attack at unexpected times, resistance to breaking off attacks even under heavy casualties. It recommended maximum defensive strength when engaging Canadians and warned that normal defensive positions might prove inadequate. Another document from German intelligence files analyzed Allied combat effectiveness by nationality. Americans were noted as well-equipped, but sometimes poorly coordinated. British were methodical and professional, but predictable. Canadians were described as extremely aggressive, with combat intensity comparable to Eastern Front operations. There was that phrase again, Eastern Front intensity. The Germans kept returning to it as though they could only explain Canadian aggression by comparing it to the brutal warfare against the Soviet Union. Montgomery understood what they meant. On the Eastern Front, armies fought with a ferocity unknown in the West, no quarter given or expected, entire units wiped out, cities reduced to rubble. Casualty rates that would be considered catastrophic in France or Italy were routine in Russia. Western Allied forces generally fought differently: more restraint, more respect for conventions, more concern for limiting destruction. But Canadians, according to German assessment, fought with Eastern Front intensity while operating in the West. It made them anomalous and extremely dangerous. Montgomery closed the last file and sat back in his chair. The evidence was comprehensive and consistent. Canadian forces fought more aggressively than British forces. They took higher casualties but achieved objectives faster. They showed troubling patterns of prisoner killings. German soldiers feared them specifically. Now he needed to understand the mathematics of it. He pulled casualty statistics for the Normandy campaign and began analyzing the numbers. What he found confirmed his suspicions. Canadian divisions suffered casualty rates measurably higher than British formations engaging similar German forces in similar terrain. More concerning was the casualty exchange ratio. British forces inflicted roughly 2 German casualties for every British loss, partly through superior artillery and air support. Canadian forces achieved closer to even exchange. They inflicted heavy casualties on Germans, but also took heavy casualties themselves. This was mutual attrition warfare, not the favorable exchange Montgomery preferred. He ran calculations on sustainability. At current rates, Canadian divisions were consuming replacements significantly faster than British formations. Veteran troops were being killed and replaced by inexperienced soldiers at a rate that would eventually degrade unit effectiveness. In a short campaign with abundant resources, this was manageable. In a long war, it would be catastrophic. Montgomery thought about the strategic context. September 1944. Germany retreating but still fighting. Allied material superiority overwhelming. The war seemed winnable within a year, maybe less. In that context, Canadian aggressive tactics made sense. Accept heavy casualties to achieve breakthrough. End campaigns quickly before cumulative losses become unbearable. But if the war dragged on, if Germany managed to stabilize the front and force a long grinding advance into 1946 or 1947, then Canadian methods would bleed their divisions white. The same fate that had befallen British forces in the previous war when aggressive tactics met sustained resistance. Montgomery made his decision. He would use Canadian divisions for breakthrough operations where their aggression was most valuable. British divisions would handle exploitation and sustained operations, different tools for different jobs. It meant accepting higher Canadian casualties. It meant employing different standards for different parts of his force. It meant calculations about lives that were uncomfortable but necessary. Outside, dawn was breaking over France. Another day of war. Montgomery stood and walked to the window, watching Canadian troops in the distance preparing for another day of combat. They were the weapon he needed. He would use them accordingly, and he would live with the cost. Looking back in September, Montgomery understood Operation Totalize differently than he had in late July when he had planned it. Then, he had assigned Canadian divisions to lead the assault based on instinct and their recent performance. He had known they fought aggressively. He had seen their results at Juno Beach and in the fighting around Caen. When he needed a breakthrough south of Caen to open the road to Falaise, he had given the mission to the Canadians because something in his professional judgment told him they would execute it regardless of cost. Now, with intelligence reports in hand and weeks of analysis complete, he understood why his instinct had been correct. The operational concept for Totalize had been unconventional from the start. A night attack with armor advancing through darkness behind a rolling artillery barrage, bomber support to devastate German positions, infantry following tanks in armored personnel carriers, speed and violence to overwhelm German defenses before they could organize effective resistance. It was aggressive, risky, dependent on maintaining momentum even when things went wrong, not the kind of careful set-piece battle Montgomery usually favored. It was exactly the kind of operation Canadian divisions were built to execute. He found his notes from the July planning session with Simons. The conversation had been brief and direct. "Guy, I need a breakthrough south of Caen. German positions are strong. I'm giving you 1st Canadian Army for the operation. You'll plan it." Simons had studied the maps. "Heavily defended, sir. SS Panzer units. This will be costly. Can you do it?" "Yes, sir." No hesitation, no qualification. Just certainty. Montgomery had approved Simons's plan with minor modifications: night attack, concentrated armor, aggressive exploitation. It was bold. It was also exactly what Simon's divisions were designed to do. The operation launched on the night of August 7th. Reports had come in throughout the night and following day. Initial success, Canadian armor breaking through the first German defensive line. Heavy casualties but forward momentum maintained. Confusion in darkness. Units losing cohesion. Communications breaking down. The chaos that always accompanied night operations. But the Canadians kept attacking. Even when tactical coordination broke down, even when casualties mounted, Canadian forces maintained forward pressure. They did not pause to reorganize. They pushed forward into the gap they had created, accepting losses to maintain the breakthrough. By the end of the second day, they had advanced 12 miles through heavily defended terrain. 40% armor losses, infantry battalions reduced to half strength, but the German defensive line was broken. Montgomery had committed British armored divisions through the gap. Fresh troops advancing through the breach Canadian forces had torn open. Within 2 days, British armor was 20 miles beyond the original front line. Strategic success. The Falaise pocket would follow, where German forces would be encircled and destroyed, but those Canadian casualty figures. Montgomery reviewed them again now with full understanding of what they represented. He had used Canadian divisions as a battering ram. They had smashed through at terrible cost to themselves. Then British forces had exploited that breach with comparatively lower casualties. Different forces for different roles, rational military planning, also a calculation that valued lives differently based on national origin. Montgomery was honest enough with himself to acknowledge this. He used Canadians for the most dangerous assaults because they would execute them. He used British forces for sustained operations because British strategic planning required preserving force strength for the long term. It was effective. It was also morally complex in ways that would trouble him increasingly as the war continued. The war ground forward through autumn and winter, Allied forces advancing across France and Belgium toward Germany, every river crossing contested, every city defended, the German army dying but not surrendering. By February 1945, Montgomery was planning the Rhineland campaign, the final push to cross the Rhine River and invade Germany proper. His initial operational plan assigned Canadian divisions to conduct the main assault through the most heavily defended sector. Again, it was what they were good at. It was also becoming a pattern that could not be sustained much longer. Simons requested a meeting. He arrived at Montgomery's headquarters on a cold February morning, snow falling across the Belgian countryside. Montgomery received him in his office. 2 years of working together had created professional respect between them, but recent months had strained the relationship. The weight of cumulative casualties hung between them. Simons did not waste time. "Sir, I need to discuss the Rhineland operational plan." "Go ahead." "You've assigned 1st Canadian Army to conduct the primary assault through the most heavily defended sector." Again. Montgomery nodded. "The Siegfried Line fortifications are strongest there. I need aggressive assault to break through before Germans can bring up reserves." "Sir, with respect, my divisions have been conducting primary assaults since Normandy. We fought through the Scheldt in October and November, brutal fighting in flooded terrain. We've been in continuous heavy combat for 8 months. I'm aware of your operational tempo, Guy. Then you're also aware that Canadian casualty rates are significantly higher than British formations. We're consuming replacements faster than they can be trained and shipped from Canada." Montgomery set down the pen he had been holding. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking you to assign British divisions to share the burden of primary assaults. My men have earned rest. They've accomplished every mission assigned, but they're exhausted, sir, and there's political pressure from Ottawa about casualty rates." This was the conversation Montgomery had been anticipating since September. "Guy, I assign missions based on operational requirements and unit capabilities. Canadian divisions excel at aggressive assault operations. That's assessment of proven effectiveness. It's also using us as expendable shock troops while preserving British divisions." The words were blunt, impossible to ignore. Montgomery could have responded with anger. Instead, he chose honesty. "Sit down." Simons sat. Montgomery walked to the window. "You're right. I use Canadian divisions for the most difficult assaults because you're the best I have at it. Your troops fight with aggression that exceeds other formations under my command. When I need breakthrough regardless of cost, I assign it to Canadians." He turned to face Simons. "Is that unfair? Perhaps. Is it effective? Absolutely. The question is whether effectiveness justifies the disparity." "And your answer, sir?" Montgomery returned to his desk and pulled out statistics his staff had compiled. "Canadian divisions represent 10% of my total force. They've suffered 15% of casualties since D-Day. I've known these numbers since September, when intelligence first reported that German soldiers fear your troops specifically." He showed the statistics to Simons. "I've studied your combat methods extensively. You fight the way Germans fought in 1940. Fast, aggressive, accepting casualties to maintain momentum. It's effective in our current context. Material superiority, enemy in retreat. Objective is breakthrough. But I'm aware this approach is sustainable only because we're winning and the war is nearly over. Had this conflict continued to 1946 or 1947, I would have had to change how I employ your divisions. Your casualty rates would bleed you white." Montgomery paused. "Your methods work in specific contexts, short campaigns with overwhelming superiority, where aggressive assault produces breakthrough that ends fighting quickly. In a long war of attrition, your approach would be catastrophic." "Then what will you do, sir?" "I'll modify the Rhineland plan. British divisions will share primary assault missions. Canadian formations will receive priority for rest and refit. When we cross the Rhine, I'll use you for exploitation rather than initial breakthrough." Simons studied Montgomery carefully. "Why the change?" "Because the war is ending, Guy. Germany is collapsing. We no longer need breakthrough at any cost. We need sustained pressure. That requires fresh divisions. Your men have earned rest." It was not the complete truth. Political pressure from Ottawa had been mounting. The Canadian government was asking uncomfortable questions about why their forces bore disproportionate burden. But beyond politics, Montgomery genuinely believed Canadian divisions were near their breaking point. One more major assault at current casualty rates might push them past effective combat strength. He did not want to destroy the force he had used so effectively. Simons nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir. My men will appreciate it." After Simons left, Montgomery sat alone, thinking about command decisions and their consequences. He had used Canadian divisions aggressively because they fought aggressively. By consistently assigning them to operations that rewarded aggression, he had reinforced their aggressive identity. How much had he contributed to the very methods he now worried might be unsustainable? He did not have good answers. Only the knowledge that he had made decisions he believed correct at the time, trying to win a war with acceptable casualties. That was all any commander could do. 3 weeks later, in early March, a classified message arrived from the Canadian government through military channels. Montgomery read it alone in his office. Ottawa was threatening to withdraw Canadian forces from Montgomery's command if casualty rates did not decrease substantially. The political situation in Canada was becoming critical. The public was learning about disproportionate losses. Members of Parliament were demanding answers. The message was diplomatically worded, but the meaning was clear: reduce Canadian casualties or lose Canadian forces entirely. Montgomery sat with the message for a long time. This was the political reality of coalition warfare. He could make all the military calculations he wanted about effectiveness and sustainability, but ultimately he commanded forces that belonged to sovereign nations with their own political imperatives. He had been so focused on tactical effectiveness that he had missed the political sustainability question. Even if Canadian divisions could physically continue high-casualty operations, politically they could not. The choice was stark: change how he employed Canadian forces, or risk losing them entirely just as the war entered its final phase. Montgomery drafted his response to Ottawa. He outlined the modifications to the Rhineland Plan. He detailed the rest and refit schedule for Canadian divisions. He committed to employing them in roles that would reduce casualty rates going forward. He sent the message and then sat in the gathering darkness of his office, understanding that he had just been reminded of the limits of a commander's power. Political reality constrained military decisions. National interest shaped coalition strategy. He could use forces effectively, but he could not use them however he wanted without consequence. It was a lesson he should have learned earlier. The war in Europe ended 3 months later, in May 1945. German resistance collapsed suddenly. Units that had fought fanatically through winter surrendered en masse in spring. The Rhine crossings succeeded with relatively light casualties. Canadian divisions participated, but not as primary assault forces. They advanced into northern Germany alongside British formations, accepting surrenders, occupying territory, watching the war end. When Germany formally surrendered on May 8th, Montgomery was at his headquarters reviewing final operational reports. The casualty statistics for the entire Northwest Europe campaign were compiled and presented to him. Total losses across 21st Army Group, British casualties, Canadian casualties, German casualties inflicted. Canadian forces had suffered approximately 42,000 casualties from D-Day to VE Day. 11% of total Canadian forces committed. British forces had suffered roughly 9% losses, but Canadian divisions had also achieved disproportionate results. In terms of ground taken, objectives seized, German forces defeated, they had accomplished more per capita than any other formation under Montgomery's command. Effectiveness and cost, inextricably linked. Montgomery drafted his official assessment of Canadian forces for the military record. Professional, complimentary, true as far as it went. But that night, in his private quarters, he wrote something different in his journal. The Canadians fought with exceptional courage and determination throughout the campaign. They achieved results through aggressive methods that proved highly effective in the context of 1944 to 45, when Allied material superiority was overwhelming and German defeat was inevitable. Had circumstances been different, had the war continued longer or resources been more constrained, their methods might have led to catastrophic casualties without proportional results. They were fortunate in their timing. We were all fortunate. As commander, I used Canadian divisions for the most difficult operations because they excelled at aggressive assault. This was tactically sound but morally complex. I accepted higher Canadian casualties because their methods produced breakthrough that ultimately saved lives by ending campaigns sooner. Whether this calculation was correct, history will judge. Total casualties were lower than they might have been. The war ended in victory. But I used men as tools, and some tools I used harder than others. He closed the journal and sat in silence for a long time. The victory parade through London came in June 1945. Miles of marching soldiers, British troops, American troops, Polish, French, Belgian, and Canadian. Montgomery stood on the reviewing stand as Canadian divisions marched past. These were not the same men who had landed at Juno Beach a year earlier. Many of those men were dead. Others were wounded, invalided home, carrying injuries that would last their lifetimes. But the units marched with pride, colors flying, medals gleaming. They had earned German fear and Allied respect. They had paid for both in blood. A young Canadian lieutenant, barely 20 years old, saluted as he passed. Fresh-faced, probably a replacement who had arrived in the last months of the war. He would tell his grandchildren someday that he had served in the fearsome Canadian divisions, that German soldiers had feared his uniform. He would probably never know what that fear had cost the men who came before him. Montgomery returned the salute. After the parade, a reporter asked about Canadian forces. It was the question Montgomery had been expecting. Field Marshal, German prisoners consistently reported fearing Canadian troops more than other Allied forces. Can you comment on why that was? Montgomery chose his words carefully. Canadian soldiers fought with exceptional courage and determination. They earned the respect of their enemies through combat effectiveness. That respect contributed significantly to Allied victory. The reporter pressed. But sir, what made them different? Montgomery paused. He thought about intelligence reports and casualty statistics, about Dieppe and Ortona and Totalize, about men who fought aggressively because they had learned that hesitation kills, about calculations he had made and prices he had accepted. They fought the way the situation required, he said finally. In 1944 and 1945, that meant aggressive assault. They did what was necessary. We were fortunate that circumstances allowed their methods to succeed. It was true, it was also incomplete. That night, alone in his quarters, Montgomery made one final entry in his journal about Canadian forces. The war is over. Canadian divisions suffered 42,000 casualties, 11% of forces committed, higher than British rates, higher than I am comfortable with. But they achieved results that justify the cost if one accepts that some lives may be spent more freely than others in pursuit of victory. I made that calculation. I used Canadian aggression because it was effective. I would make the same decision again under the same circumstances, but I will carry the weight of it. That is what commanders do. We make decisions that cost lives. We justify those decisions with victory, and we live with the knowledge of what we spent and why. The Germans feared Canadian troops because Canadian troops were fearsome. I used that fear as a weapon. It worked. Whether it was right remains between me and God and the 42,000 men who paid the price. He closed the journal and locked it in his desk. Outside, London celebrated victory. The war was over. The killing had stopped. Tomorrow would begin the work of peace. But that night, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sat in the darkness and remembered the question he had asked in September 1944 when he first learned that German soldiers feared Canadians more than British troops. What does it cost? He knew the answer now. He had known it for months. 42,000 casualties, a reputation built on aggression that bordered on brutality, prisoner killings that violated the laws of war, political tensions with Ottawa that nearly cost him Canadian forces entirely. The knowledge that he had used some men harder than others because their methods were effective and circumstances allowed it. That was the cost, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander and calculator, would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. Years later, in his memoirs, Montgomery would write carefully about Canadian forces. He praised their courage and effectiveness. He described key operations where they had been decisive. What he did not write about, at least not directly, was the burden of using them as he had, the knowledge that his decisions about employment had contributed to their casualty rates, the awareness that he had valued effectiveness over preservation because strategic circumstances allowed him to do so. Instead, he included one paragraph that hinted at complexity without fully explaining it. Canadian forces distinguished themselves throughout the campaign in northwest Europe. They fought with a ferocity that earned them the respect of both allies and enemies. German soldiers recognized Canadian troops as exceptionally dangerous opponents. This reputation was built on aggressive combat methods that proved highly effective in the operational context of 1944 to 45. Whether those same methods would have proven sustainable in different circumstances remains an open question. We were fortunate that circumstances favored their approach. It was as close as he would come to publicly acknowledging the calculations he had made. The final word came from German sources, discovered in captured archives years after the war. A post-war assessment of Allied combat effectiveness, compiled by German military intelligence officers during captivity, analyzed different national armies with professional frankness. About Canadian forces, the German analysts wrote, Canadian troops were among the most dangerous Allied opponents encountered on the Western Front. They fought with intensity typically associated with Eastern Front operations. Their aggressive assault tactics and persistence under casualties made them particularly difficult to defend against. German units facing Canadians required maximum defensive preparation and were advised to avoid engagement when possible. The high regard German soldiers held for Canadian combat effectiveness was based on repeated experience across multiple campaigns. Montgomery read this assessment in 1947, 2 years after the war ended. It confirmed what he had learned through intelligence reports in September 1944, what he had understood through careful study of Canadian operations, what he had employed in his operational planning from Totalize through the Rhine crossings. The Germans had feared Canadian troops because Canadian troops were genuinely fearsome. The reputation was earned through combat, sustained through consistent performance acknowledged by professional enemies, and Montgomery had used that reputation, that fear, that effectiveness, to help win a war. It was what commanders did. They identified strengths and exploited them. They made calculations about lives and objectives. They carried the burden of decisions that sent men to die in pursuit of victory. Montgomery had done all of this, successfully, professionally, at terrible cost. When he thought about Canadian forces in the years after the war, he thought about effectiveness and sustainability, about how aggressive methods work brilliantly in specific contexts and catastrophically in others, about how timing and circumstances can make the same tactics either genius or disaster. Most of all, he thought about the question he had raised in September 1944. What does it cost? The calculation was complete. The war was won, the price was paid. 42,000 casualties. Effectiveness purchased through blood. Victory achieved through calculations about whose lives could be spent more freely. That was the answer. That was the burden. And that was what Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery carried with him for the rest of his days. The knowledge of what he had said when he realized German soldiers feared Canadian troops more than British forces, and what he had done with that knowledge. He had said, they fought like Germans. It was observation that contained both respect and warning. Acknowledgement of effectiveness coupled with concern about sustainability. He had used them accordingly, aggressively, effectively, at significant cost. History would record the effectiveness and often forget the cost. But Montgomery remembered both, in the quiet moments, in the years after victory, in the private reflections of a commander who had used men as weapons and weapons as tools. He remembered what he had said, what he had done, and what it had cost. That was his burden. The burden of command, the burden of victory, the burden of knowing that sometimes the right decision and the easy decision are not the same thing, and that commanders must choose the right one regardless of cost.